So welcome to this session. This is being organized by several organizations, as you may see on the screen. You can also access the QR code to join this session online. This is a hybrid meeting, meaning that some participants are in the physical room while others are joining us remotely via video conference. We'll do our best to ensure everyone can participate equally. Remote participants, please use the electronic hand raise feature to ask questions and also share some comments. For those in the room, you may use available microphones on the tables. Again, welcome to this session on Beyond Extraction Towards Self-Determination, Indigenous Pathways to a Just Energy Transition. This session will cover relevant and pressing issues around pathways to a just transition as the global shift to renewable energy is posing risks and reinforcing inequalities in the region, and in fact globally, especially to Indigenous peoples. At the same time, Indigenous peoples are solution bearers to the multiple crises we are facing brought about by climate change and other development agenda. This session will explore these contrasting realities, examine the human rights implications of the transition, and spotlight pathways for shared prosperity. We have a great lineup of speakers covering topics of business and human rights, impacts of energy transition, finance, role of Indigenous peoples, and experiences on Indigenous-led initiatives and solutions. Despite our limited time, we look forward to responses and questions from the floor as we would want this session to be interactive. For the interest of time, each panel is given 6 minutes to speak. At this point, let me introduce our panelists. We are delighted to have with us experts and community leaders who are at the forefront of the critical work. On my right, I'd like to start with John Carling, an Indigenous activist, also the Director of Right Energy Partnership for Indigenous Peoples. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, Mike's, yeah, sorry for that. The Executive Director of Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, also the organization I am part of. I will be helping to moderate this session. Okay, I see that as a welcome remarks from all of us. Okay, now next is Puchoy Labog, the Southeast Asia Program Manager and representative of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Okay, I have to be correct this time. So, Dr. Pichamon Yopantong, the Chairperson and Asia-Pacific member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. To her left, okay, is an Indigenous sister from Indonesia. She is an Indigenous lawyer as well, Surti Handayani. And next to her is the Executive Director of Right Energy Partnership for Indigenous Peoples. We have Robbie Halip. Finally, that's the correct person. Okay, next is, we have our young generation, from the young generation. So, an Indigenous women activist from Nepal, Pranisha Shakya. So to start off the conversation, let us hear from our first speaker, Dr. Pichamon.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction and for inviting the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights to be part of this very important session, which is, of course, something that's close and dear to the Working Group's heart, because we have released a report to the General Assembly on the extractive sector and the just transition. Now, For businesses and investors included to discharge their responsibility to respect human rights in line with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, this is not simply about engaging in corporate social responsibility. Rather, it is about how businesses must conduct human rights due diligence to identify and address the potential and actual adverse impacts that they can have on human rights. At the heart of the guiding principles is thus the prevention of business-related human rights abuses and the creation of a new social contract among governments, businesses, and social actors to enhance corporate accountability. Let's think now about the situation when it comes to the global energy transition. When we speak of the global energy transition, we often frame it as a story of hope, if not optimism. Cleaner energy, greener technologies, a chance to avert the worst impacts of the climate crisis, but also a means to enhance energy security and drive economic growth. But beneath the surface lies another story, one that unfolds, for example, in the forests of Indonesia, in the waters of North Maluku, and in the lives of indigenous peoples. The story is not only about environmental sustainability, it is also about geopolitics, about economic interests, and about human security. And it forces us to ask, whose rights and security are being protected in this transition, and whose are being sacrificed? The global transition to renewable energy is imperative to tackling the worsening climate crisis. We know that. We also know that indigenous peoples in particular are living on the front lines of both the climate crisis and this ongoing transition. They are disproportionately affected by the devastating impacts of climate change and environmental degradation, but also by the unsustainable exploitation of resources from their lands and territories. As a result, protracted conflicts, the criminalization of indigenous human rights defenders, and a pervasive climate of mistrust have continued to inhibit meaningful and constructive engagement among states, businesses, and affected indigenous communities. While the urgency of the situation cannot be understated, this transition must be just, fair, and inclusive. As the international community mobilizes and scales up investments in renewable energy technologies, the extraction of critical minerals and metals required to develop these technologies must not come at the expense of the rights nor the well-being of indigenous peoples. We must also be clear-eyed about the current global context in which these issues are unfolding. Human rights are under increasing attack, with the international human rights system also being placed under greater strain. A particular concern here is the lack of policy coherence between certain stakeholder approaches to the energy transition and the fundamental human rights standards enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, among others. It is therefore necessary for critical minerals extraction to be undertaken through a human rights-based approach, one that is in full and strict alignment with the requirements of free, prior, and informed consent. So let us be unequivocal here. Consent from a government or individual landowners does not equate to consent from indigenous communities themselves. Indigenous leadership is key to creating a conducive environment for corporate responsibility and long-term value amid the energy transition. Co-ownership models alongside indigenous peoples-owned and led renewable energy projects offer promising pathways towards achieving rights-respecting outcomes in both the critical minerals and other extractive sectors. By proactively prioritizing indigenous ownership and leadership in these ventures, businesses can cultivate trust and partnerships that result in more sustainable projects while simultaneously reducing legal and operational risks. Various Indigenous-led initiatives are already proving crucial in shaping more robust policies and regulations to safeguard Indigenous lands, resources, and rights, as well as facilitating equitable partnership models with businesses that can help bring about shared prosperity. So allow me to conclude here with a thought that sums up the moral and economic imperative before us all. With the polio crisis constituting the reality on our doorstep, solidarity, especially with the plight of Indigenous peoples and other at-risk groups, is needed now more so than ever before. The existential threat posed by climate change necessitates that we be ambitious in our vision and steadfast in our resolve to achieve a zero-carbon economy that is both transformative and rights-respecting. There must be coherence in our policies as well as alignment between commitments made and actions taken. by duly recognizing the invaluable leadership of Indigenous peoples as the custodians and protectors of around 80% of the world's biodiversity, states, businesses, and other social actors can work collaboratively to advance just transition pathways that contribute to a sustainable and more resilient future. So thank you once again for inviting the working group to be part of this. We very much hope that we will be able to continue to support the important work that colleagues on this panel today are doing to ensure that the just transition is not just a transition, but in fact a just one.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. PPMAN. Thank you for setting the stage of our discussion, affirming the challenges that we're facing right now, and also giving us the hope to continue the work. Now, let us transition to the next speaker. I will now call Puchoy to give us an overview in relation to tracking transition minerals and impacts of energy transition. Over to you.
Thank you, Jo, and good morning, everyone. Happy to be here, and it's a privilege to represent the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. So just a quick introduction on our organization. We are an international human rights organization that tracks and monitors human rights abuse that are linked to businesses, and this includes renewable energy companies and mining companies that are part of the just transition issues. So my role today is to provide some context on what is happening with regards to our transition, or the world's effort to transition to renewable energy sources. I'd like to preface my presentation by saying that climate change is, of course, a global catastrophe, and it requires the world to come together and shift our energy sources to more sustainable, more renewable sources. But this transition, of course, cannot happen at the expense of the rights of communities, rights of indigenous peoples and workers, and the environment. But what are we seeing? So these are just examples of our data. We present our data, by the way, in 8 languages, so you can find these in business-humanrights.org. And so what are we seeing? And just a quick caveat on our data. So these are based on publicly available information. So you could just imagine that it's just the tip of the iceberg, given that there's, of course, restrictions on civic space, and not all issues are being covered by the media. And so just so you know about how we do our methodology. So this is our latest analysis, as you can see in the screen, on transition minerals. So we have a transition minerals tracker. This year, we analyzed our tracker. And the tracker is, it monitors the allegations, human rights allegations that are linked to the mining of transition minerals such as bauxite, cobalt, copper, lithium, manganese, zinc, and nickel. And this year we added iron ore as a key mineral in the manufacturing of RE infrastructures. And what we saw, as you can see from the screen, is that there are 835 allegations of human rights abuse between 2010 to 2024, including 157 attacks against human rights defenders. And 156 allegations were recorded in 2024 alone. So human rights defenders pay the highest price. Nearly 20% of all allegations recorded were attacks against human rights defenders, including 25 strategic lawsuits against public participation. These are just some of our key findings that I wanted to flash on the screen on environmental impacts, impacts on workers, impacts on local communities. I'll just take a second for you to take that in. And then wanted to zoom in on Asia-Pacific region. So Asia-Pacific accounted for 15% of all the human rights abuse allegations. And there's essentially an overall increase in the number of allegations recorded in the region. In Southeast Asia, Indonesia, and the Philippines and Myanmar all rich in transition minerals, have seen an uptick in allegations of human rights abuse. And in 2023, we actually did a study on the scale and scope of human rights and environmental impacts of Chinese overseas investment in transition minerals across the globe. And Asia Pacific had the highest number of allegations with 43 out of 102 allegations. And Indonesia accounted for the highest in Asia Pacific. I mentioned earlier that, that human rights defenders pay the highest price. And related to our transition minerals tracker analysis is our global analysis on human rights defenders. So our data reveals, this is data from 2015, 10-year analysis to 2024, that yes, that 89% of human rights defenders attacked were land and environmental defenders. And in addition, 96% of indigenous defenders experienced attacks over the past decade advocated for land and environmental rights. And in our data collection, mining was the #1 sector that was associated with the attacks. And nearly 3/4 of attacks targeted climate, land, and environmental defenders. 1 in 5 attacks were on indigenous peoples, despite comprising only 6% of the world's population. And Asia Pacific, together with Latin America, have consistently been the most dangerous regions in the world in terms of attacks on human rights defenders. Just a quick rundown on Asia Pacific's stats. Philippines recorded the highest number of attacks, 411. And as you can see, in these countries, mining is, again, the #1 sector in terms of human rights defenders attacks, except Cambodia, which had logging and lumber, which is sort of also related to mining because there's a lot of deforestation that happens in the mining sector. These are the most frequent types of attacks. Slaps is #1, followed by killings, and yeah, just take a moment to see the data. And this is just, again, ranking the sectors in terms of number of attacks. It's mining, followed by agribusiness, and then fossil fuels. So I think I'll end there. But our hope really is for the key stakeholders, civil society, governments, even companies, to really think about the transition to renewable energy and how we are doing this at the expense of human rights, and that there is actually hope even in the midst of all these violations, and we can learn from the practice of local communities, indigenous peoples, and shared prosperity models, which will be discussed this morning. Thank you.
Thanks for giving us further context of violations and abuses against environmental defenders. And as we saw from the data, Asia Pacific is in the spotlight. I believe each of us can relate to this data and information and further reflect within our own country. And speaking of reflection, I would now call Joanne Carling to give us trends and analysis in the criminalization of indigenous peoples in just transition. Over to you.
Hello, good morning. I just want to also briefly introduce my organization, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, which is an organization addressing human rights violations and criminalization of indigenous peoples, at the same time also advancing justice. So it's a global indigenous-led organization, and we focus in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. Now, going back to the trends in Asia, so Asia is experiencing an unprecedented surge of investment in renewable energy and transition minerals. Hydropower dams, solar parks, wind farms, geothermal plants, and large-scale mining projects are rapidly expanding across the region. These projects are often presented as essential to achieving a just transition away from fossil fuels, but as PPMAN has mentioned, for the reality on the ground for indigenous peoples tells a different story, which is one of exclusion, criminalization, and perpetuation of historical injustice. Can I ask? Yeah. Since 2021, Indigenous Peoples' Rights International has documented 24 cases of human rights violations linked directly to just energy transition projects in Asia, affecting more than 97,000 Indigenous peoples. Most of these cases, 18, are tied to hydropower projects in the Philippines, India, Nepal, and others relate to solar, wind, geothermal, and transition mineral mining projects in Indonesia, Cambodia, and the Philippines. This data is a fraction of what is happening on the ground in relation to imposed just transition-related projects. The violations are severe. In the Philippines, 9 Tumandok leaders were massacred in a military raid after they organized resistance against the Halaur River Dam, and a woman leader, Julie Katamin, was later assassinated after publicly denouncing the killing. In India's Arunachal Pradesh, the leaders who led peaceful protests against the Upper Siang projects were met not with dialogue, but with fabricated charges of attempted murder and inciting violence. In Nepal, indigenous communities describe how hydropower has brought displacement, repression, and the erosion of cultural practices, branding this as wave of green colonization. Beyond these cases, a disturbing pattern emerges across the region. Indigenous defenders are frequently criminalized for asserting our rights. At least 34 leaders have been charged with serious offenses such as perjury, illegal possession of firearms, or even attempted homicide. Charges clearly decide to silence opposition and instill fear to indigenous communities. Community leaders are also face arbitrary detention and intimidation, as well as harassment and vilification, often labeled as terrorists simply for defending our territories. The violation of free, prior, and informed consent is widespread. In at least 15 documented projects, FPIC was ignored or manipulated. Instead of consultation, indigenous peoples are met with coercion, threats, displacement, or militarization of our lands. These violations do not only strip us of our rights, they threaten our survival, our cultures, and our ability for future generations to carry forward our knowledge and way of life. This condition is driven by massive financial flows. The International Energy Agency projects that Southeast Asia will need around 130 billion every year by 2030 to meet clean energy goals, almost double the current investment. In the past decade, foreign investment in clean energy reached 3.5 billion in Indonesia, 1.3 billion in Thailand, and nearly 700 million in Vietnam, with hydropower, geothermal, and mineral extraction at the forefront. Globally, more than half of transition minerals are located on or near indigenous territories. The demand for transition minerals such as nickel, copper, and rare earth elements has made countries like Indonesia and Philippines global hotspots for extraction, often at the expense of indigenous peoples and our territories. Despite this flow of money, less than 1% of climate finance globally reaches indigenous peoples. Instead, investments continue to prioritize large-scale top-down projects that displace indigenous communities, destroy our sustainable livelihoods, rather than empower our communities. Adding insult to injury, many host communities of energy projects do not have electricity. In many Asian countries, indigenous peoples are not formally recognized as distinct rights holders, which enables these violations to happen with impunity. Where recognition exists, implementation is weak. FPIC is routinely bypassed, and governments often treat indigenous resistance as a security threat. Instead of protecting defenders, states criminalize us, invoking anti-terror laws, banning protests, and deploying armed forces to clear the way for projects. This reality directly contradicts the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. The UNGPs clearly affirmed the duty of states to protect human rights, the responsibility of business to respect rights, and the need for access to remedy when harms occur. Yet these principles are rarely applied in Asia's energy transition. The energy transition cannot be just if it builds on injustice. Governments must recognize indigenous peoples' rights. Can you, the next slide? Indigenous peoples' rights in law and practice, and make FPIC a binding requirement for all projects. Business and investors must carry out genuine human rights due diligence, stop projects that violate rights, and ensure accountability mechanisms accessible to affected communities. We must redirect financing to indigenous-led renewable energy solutions, initiatives that respect our lands, cultures, and governance systems, while effectively contributing to climate goals. These are the urgent actions on the path towards energy sovereignty and self-determination of indigenous peoples. Governments, business, and investors have a responsibility to ensure that the energy transition does not repeat the mistakes of the past. Indigenous peoples are not barriers to development. We are leaders in protecting biodiversity and advancing sustainability for the generations to come. Let me be clear. Indigenous peoples fully support decarbonization, and we also want clean energy. But it cannot come at the expense of our lives, our livelihoods, and our dignity. We can build partnerships with states and business through a truly just and transformative energy transition by putting people and the planet first, based on people's needs, good governance, accountability, social equity, sustainability, and shared prosperity for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. So we are hearing a pattern of systemic violations to indigenous peoples across our region. And we saw how our foundational rights as indigenous peoples, such as our free, prior, and informed consent, are being abused, if not ignored totally, despite available international and legal frameworks to uphold due diligence. And so, as we safeguards these rights, we now move on to the virtual discussion on safeguarding and advancing people-centric just energy transition. Let us now call on Bernadette Victorio. Over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to our partners and co-organizers of this session. It is an honor for me to share the panel with members of the indigenous peoples and community leaders. Again, my name is Bernadette Victorio. I lead the Fair Finance Asia program. For those of you who have not heard of our program before, Fair Finance Asia is a network of over 90 civil society organizations working to promote transparency and accountability in the Asia regional financial sector in support of the rights and well-being of local communities. Now, we have already heard the role of the financial sector in the previous interventions, but from our perspective, we see that while Asian financial institutions and regulators are increasing their engagement in just transition and decarbonization activities, we at FFA still see significant gaps, particularly in the area of energy. We still see money flowing into fossil finance projects despite the clear need to phase them out. There is a severe lack of meaningful engagement with communities, women's rights organizations, project-affected communities, especially indigenous peoples. There is also a concerning and dangerous emergence of false solutions, specifically nuclear energy as a clean alternative. It has so many risks, including unsafe proliferation and waste management. We cannot even go into those issues. We don't have the time for it simply. We see a harsh reality where communities, especially in the global south, are suffering from the impacts of climate change while simultaneously being exploited for our critical minerals needed for the green transition and decarbonization. The benefits aren't only being shared fairly, they are also aggravating existing inequalities across the region and even globally. Moreover, many Asian countries are still heavily reliant on fossil fuels, and the lack of resources and clear timelines to transition away from them, leaving our future, our collective future, uncertain. The financial sector has a critical role to play, and we are calling on them to make specific actionable changes. Financial institutions must develop detailed, transparent strategies to address the climate impacts of their investments. This isn't just about a general commitment, it's about having specific policies that are implemented in relation to high impact sectors like fossil fuels and extractives. The focus needs to shift as well from a top-down risk-based approach to one that supports local communities and uphold their rights and well-being. This means providing grants, not just loans, to avoid adding to the debt burden of vulnerable nations and local communities that are paying for those debts. And this specifically applies to international financial institutions and multilateral development banks. We need stronger mechanisms to monitor and verify climate impacts, and financial institutions must proactively protect community members and civil society organizations from retaliation when they speak out against harmful projects and impacts. Climate goals also cannot be isolated. They must be integrated with broader social goals that are including gender equality, youth empowerment, and the rights of indigenous peoples. Finally, a truly just transition must center the rights of indigenous peoples. And this means ensuring free, prior, and informed consent for any project on their land and recognizing their traditional knowledge as a vital part of the sustainable solutions needed to move ahead. Overall, this means that just transition and decarbonization targets must be supported by regulatory and safeguard policies, as well as government mechanisms that protect communities, especially the local communities that we are working with. We need robust environmental and social impact analysis, that strong safeguards to be mandatory parts of the energy project's implementation. Financial institutions should prioritize locally led adaptation and financing smaller scale community-based renewable energy projects, for example, founded on indigenous knowledge and practices. These are not only cleaner, but also empower local communities and create sustainable livelihoods. The transition must include a strong commitment to reparations and robust grievance mechanisms for communities that have suffered from devastating project impacts. And finally, at the core, project financing and cross-border investments should be guided by the do no harm principle. If a project causes harm to the environment, to local communities, and indigenous peoples, it should not be funded. Thank you.
Thank you. So we are done with our first set of speakers, giving us the overall situation and challenging us how to move ahead. So at this point, moving on from these discussions, we are now opening the floor for questions and answers. We want to hear your insights, responses, feedback in relation to our discussion. Anyone from the floor or also from our online participants? Sorry, yeah. Please go ahead and introduce yourself briefly.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Andrew from the Pacific. It's quite a somber assessment of where things are for Indigenous communities. And I guess my question is, what has your experience been with local media and national media? Because I think telling the stories of Indigenous activists being targeted on the ground with violence, telling the media those stories can be very powerful in terms of securing public support for our fight, our existence, our cause. And has that experience always been positive, or has the media been reluctant to tell our stories? Because I know that people who work in the media don't always have Indigenous communities in mind when they're doing their jobs. So yeah, what has your experience been with local and national media?
Yes, I think that is a very profound question. Is there any more question? Then maybe we can take two and then we proceed to our speakers to respond. Please.
Okay, my name is Zubair Torwali. I'm from Swat, Pakistan. So I found that in the data presented here, there were examples of abuses from Nepal, India, Philippines, and many other Southeast Asian countries, but Pakistan was missing. I think probably there were no data available for you to document that. And in my case, we are indigenous in the mountains of Pakistan. There are multiple examples of violations. So I hope to see that data included in those things, in those documentation. Thank you.
Okay, is that related to the initial questions? Our brother from, okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Song Ting from Kachin State, near China border. That we have a lot of, you can just Google it now, you can see a lot of rare earth mining, which has exploited by the Chinese illegal companies in Kachin State. So I'm particularly from this region. Yeah, my question also the same. I am really hoping that I would see some data or some information here, but it's nothing. So I really want you to all know that it's a disaster in Kachin State, not just degradation, not just deforestation. It's disaster. I'm from Kachin Resource Concern Group representative. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for all those questions. Now we can hear from our speakers to respond.
Yes, just very quickly, I prefaced my presentation by saying that our data is based on publicly available information. So it has to be posted online before we count it as an allegation. So that's our methodology. And sadly, I also mentioned that, the data is just the tip of the iceberg. Especially there are allegations, media reports. Sometimes there are no media reports on certain incidents because a state or an area is just, there's no civic space, no journalists. Journalists are being harassed, killed, red tagged. This happens also in the Philippines. Indonesia is becoming, more restrictive. And our brother from Myanmar, Kachin State, it's I think Earth Rights International covered extensively what's happening there in terms of rare earth mining, and yeah, it's just the sources are very scarce because of the situation, and the same thing that's happening also in Pakistan. There's just not enough available data, but you can of course reach out to us whenever there are allegations, and we can also yeah, they have some sort of not really a campaign, but like expose the what's happening also in the countries.
Yeah, just to quickly say that we're willing to get the data from you, so we can add. We don't rely only on secondary data. We also collect primary data. So let's make sure to connect. Thank you. We want to make your issues visible as possible. On the question on media, we experience both bad and good. Some media are sympathetic. But some actually support the allegation that these people deserve being arrested, being killed because they are terrorists or they are against the government. So some, especially those that are supported by governments, unfortunately, carry that narrative. So that narrative also affects a public view that instead of putting more attention, they believe that. And that's the kind of narrative that we want to change, because the prevalent narrative is that we are anti-development. We're preventing, if people are opposing, they are preventing or denying development for other people. And that's the narrative that is still dominant in media that we need to correct. And we hope you can help us change that narrative and present the reality, but also the contributions of indigenous peoples, that we are actually doing humanity a service by protecting the environment, and when we are not the enemies. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that will give us now a good transition to our next set of speakers who are going to provide narratives from the ground. So to provide concrete examples and stories from the ground, I would like to start with Surti Handayani from Indonesia. She's going to tell us more about the case of Indonesia on their story of resistance and collective action. Over to you.
Thank you, Joanne. Good morning, Rantu afternoon. On behalf of Indigenous Lawyer Association, or PPMAN, which is also the member of Zero Tolerance Initiative, I would like to thank to UN Voluntary Fund who support me to be here, and I would share about the Ohonga Namanyawa indigenous community impacted by nickel mining. The Ohonga Namanyawa is really difficult to pronounce. They are the last guardian of the forest at the North Maluku. Around 19,000 hectares they protected, and still practicing the life rotations and cultivations. But they're facing a lot of conflict, and also they face the resettlement based on the state law and regulations. And then they're also facing the mining concessions around 172.901 hectares for nickel mining. And okay, this is for the left one. This is one of elders who we can contact because they decided to self-isolation to protect the forest. Behind him, the forest wall bulldozed to nickel mining area. And then the right one, this is the map about the nickel mining concessions through the Ohonga Namanyawa territories. There's not only nickel mining inside the forest, but there are 3 concessions. Nickel, other concessions areas means gold mining, and other concession for logging. And then Ohonga Namanyawa based our data and we involved with the cases, they're facing any impact of extractive industries without any FPIC implement well through the community, including violence, criminalization. At least since 2016 until now, there are 10 indigenous members still in prisons. And then the discriminations, while they called Ohungan Namanyawa is Tobelo Dalam, this is very stereotype. And then contributing to marginalize the community. The member, there's less than 500 persons to protect. And then still lack of recognition for indigenous peoples, not only in Ohungan Namanyawa, but also through indigenous peoples in Indonesia. Livelihood risks as well, because they are live through the forest. They use life rotation and cultivation to sustainable their activities and their life, including forced settlement. Use the government's program for housing the Ohungan Namanyawa. Based on those housing program, they decrease the number of Ohungan Namanyawa peoples because they couldn't adapt it with housing permanent. Again, the criminalization, while one of them died in prison on March 2019. In our analysis, the gaps between law and practices, the participations and FPIC through the environmental laws in our countries mandated to the for community participation, but in practice, FPIC is rarely implemented meaningfully. And then legal pluralism versus state control. The state retains overarching control over natural resources, leading to systemic conflict, not only between the community and the investment, but also between the community itself. And also accountability, still weak enforcement of environmental protections, and limited access to justice for indigenous communities. Also, business interests, the dominance of business and state interests often overrides environmental and human rights concerns. This is our recommendations to means for our countries and to all of us, how to accelerate recognition of indigenous peoples and territories, and how to strengthen environmental governance, enhance access to justice, rehabilitation of the ecosystem and indigenous territory of the Ohungan Namanyawa indigenous communities, reform of policies and law enforcement that violate the rights of the Ohungan Namanyawa indigenous communities. And lastly, I have only 6 minutes. I really love this quote from Martin Luther King: "Injustice everywhere, anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for ending that with a strong message. Yeah, indeed, we still see gaps between law and practices that has impacted our brothers and sisters Ohungan Namanyawa in Indonesia. And so we should also remember, however, that as mentioned in the beginning of our opening statement by our brother from Bangladesh earlier, indigenous peoples are also solution bearers to all these multiple crises that we're facing. So to give us further illustration about the indigenous-led initiatives by our indigenous brothers and sisters across the region, I will now call Robbie Halip to share on shared prosperity and indigenous-led renewable energy.
Thank you. Thank you, Joanne, and good morning, everyone. Just to briefly introduce the Right Energy Partnership with Indigenous Peoples. It's an Indigenous-led multi-stakeholder partnership that's dedicated to expanding renewable energy systems, particularly for Indigenous peoples that respects human rights. Our commitment, the work that we do, is to ensure that renewable energy projects uphold Indigenous peoples' rights, but also address energy poverty in Indigenous communities, because as mentioned earlier, we are host to many of large-scale renewable energy projects, but Indigenous communities often don't have access to energy or even electricity within their communities. Now, in this work that we do, as mentioned, we work through partnership, and in 2018, we had a partnership with the UNDP through the GEF Small Grants program, and this project, this partnership was implemented in 7 countries, 3 in Asia, which you see on the screen right now, in Cambodia, Nepal, and Timor-Leste. The first community that you see there on the screen in Cambodia, Cabalromias, this is a community that's affected by the Lower Sasan Dam. They refuse to leave their community. They refuse to be displaced by the project, but because of the rising waters, they have to move upland to a safer area. But in the area where they relocated, voluntarily relocated, they had no source of clean water. They have to travel back to the dam area to be able to have water. But the water from the dam is not also clean, which is causing health concerns for Indigenous peoples there. So through the REP UNDP partnership, solar water pump was provided to the community who resettled, the Bunong Indigenous community who resettled in the new area. Now, this is not just talking about access to clean water and sanitation, but it's also talking about the protection of the remaining ancestral territory of the Bunong Indigenous peoples in Cabalromias. So they are currently protecting what's left of their territory, which is 7,835 hectares of ancestral land. The second community, the Nom Nam Liar Community Protected Area, this is also with the Bunong Indigenous peoples, where solar panels were installed to enhance their ecotourism livelihood. No? Now, this community is just beside a very big rubber plantation. Their ancestral area was actually totally reduced to accommodate the rubber plantation, and they are now left with 661 hectares to utilize and manage. And this 661 hectares is also under threat if they don't show any development, any economic development within the area. Thus, the support for ecotourism and the installation of the solar panels would help encourage more tourists to come to the area, stay in their accommodation, but also to enhance water access in their ecotourism area. In Nepal, solar water pumps for irrigation were also provided, supporting Tharo Indigenous peoples in Badia, southwestern Nepal, and also in Humla, northwestern Nepal. This is a very far-flung community with the Bote Indigenous peoples, where solar electrification and also training of Indigenous women to become solar engineers were provided. In Timor-Leste, it more looked at electrification of households, but also the sacred houses. We know that in Timor-Leste, for Indigenous peoples in Timor-Leste, sacred houses are very important to them. Families are anchored to their sacred houses, and that's where they gather collectively to strengthen their solidarity, but also their communal cohesion. And with IPHRD, we had a very unique project with them, which is a South-South Indigenous to Indigenous peoples exchange of knowledge, capacity, and technology, where Indigenous peoples from Malaysia, who's been working on community-based renewable energy, traveled to Indonesia to support the establishment of 2 mini hydropower projects in East Nusa Tenggara, in West Kalimantan, and also in North Kalimantan. But it's not just building mini hydropower projects. No, it's also supporting the communities in Kalimantan to be able to understand what mini hydropower projects are and how they will govern their renewable energy systems. The South-South Indigenous Peoples Exchange project also looked into participatory mapping to map out resources of indigenous peoples that needs to be protected, and that's aligned to also the maintenance of the renewable energy initiatives. And these are other initiatives of indigenous peoples outside these projects, no? Again, to address the energy poverty within communities, but also the need to strengthen traditional livelihoods. Thailand, the Hmong indigenous peoples in Thailand established their micro-hydropower system in partnership with organizations. And in the Philippines, the micro-hydropower systems that were installed are also used to support traditional livelihoods such as rice milling, sugarcane pressing, blacksmithing, and woodworking. But in the Philippines right now, the challenge is that these projects, even if it's community-based, are being red tagged by the government. And communities are scared at times to continue and even manage these projects because it's continuously being red tagged as anti-government projects. And other initiatives here, this is with Tonibong, who's long been working on community-based renewable energy. The data that you see in front of you right now are just mini hydropower projects that were installed in different communities in Sabah, Sarawak, Peninsular Malaysia, and Indonesia. Now, this is an example when you support indigenous-led renewable energy systems. As I said, it does not just look at electrification of households, increased income, but also protection of rainforest and reduction or elimination of use of diesel-based generators. And it also strengthens collective governance of indigenous peoples over the renewable energy initiatives, but also to their land, territories, and resources. The learning hubs, and I encourage everyone to also look into the declaration and roadmaps that were developed by indigenous peoples at the global and at the regional level, where we came together to really look at what is this just transition, what challenges are we facing, and what do we need to really advance a truly just transition for indigenous peoples. This is the one for Asia that we conducted last year, and the roadmap specifies the needs and capacities of indigenous peoples to really be able to advance a truly just transition. We have another event this afternoon that looks at certification. It's also aligned to this one at Conference Room 1 at 1:15 p.m. We also invite everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruby, for showing us that indigenous peoples are proactively contributing solutions to this to address climate change and to truly advance relevant just transition for indigenous peoples, despite limited resources and despite barriers to participation. And so to add on to that story, I would like now to call our last but not the least speaker. She will be discussing with us the experience also from Nepal on community-based renewable energy. Over to you, Pranisha.
Jujulapa, namaste. Good morning, everyone. My name is Pranisha Sakya from Nepal. And firstly, I would like to thank the United Nations Voluntary Fund for supporting my participation for this forum. And today I'm representing here with Community Empowerment and Social Justice Network, SEMSOS. So SEMSOS is a political, informal, and not-for-profit collective of human rights and grassroots development activists founded in 2015 and based in Lalitpur, Nepal. It works mainly for socio-economic empowerment and promotion of social justice and human rights of marginalized groups of Nepal, including indigenous peoples, minorities, rural communities, and urban poor, with particular focus on women, youth, persons with disabilities, and children of those groups. Firstly, I would like to tell more about like the community-based renewable energy project CBREP, how it was started. Since 2015, CEMSOS was increasingly working with communities affected by the hydropower and other developmental projects where we were unfortunately like being tagged and stigmatized as anti-development. So that is why we designed a community-based renewable energy project, CBREP, to show how community-led development can be undertaken, particularly for the access of energy for the indigenous peoples. Despite notable progress in improving access to electricity across Nepal, there are still many pockets of settlements around the country whereby marginalized indigenous and rural communities are living with little to no electricity and thus left in dark. While the national electricity grid is slowly expanding in the rural areas, the poor financial situations of most villagers means that they might not be able to afford the electricity charges even if their houses are connected to the grid. Therefore, the CBREP initiative is envisioned to enable indigenous and marginalized communities in Nepal to identify potential local sources of renewable energy and assist in settling up and operationalizing community-based renewable energy projects for their self-determined development. In addition, targeted assistance is also provided for the socio-economic empowerment of women and youth in the area under the initiative. Since the CBREP initiative is started in 2021, therefore in these 4 years we have already completed 3 phases whereby we have been able to provide stable electricity to more than 250 households of indigenous communities, and for the empowerment of indigenous women we have also supported 100 low carbon improved cooking stoves in 4 villages of marginalized indigenous Chepang and Tamang communities in south central Nepal. Now I would like to talk more about the approaches. So in this initiative, the first approach we undertake is the community ownership. Under the CBREP initiative, the primary approach is working with community ownership. We don't go to the communities and tell them what to do, but we share the possibilities on what can be done, and based on those requests, we provide technical and financial support to the communities. These community-led ownership initiatives have been so impactful, and the communities have undertaken a great ownership. For example, in most of the projects, pico and micro hydropower projects, the land has been voluntarily provided by the indigenous communities for the powerhouse and water tanks, such as 4-bed tanks. And as a result, the person also gets free electricity. The second approach is shared community and local contribution. In order to promote community ownership, we also ask the community to provide mainly labor contribution, but as well as financial support if possible for the procurement of the equipment and services in pico and micro hydropower projects. In the pilot phase, we also receive a financial contributions from the local government, but the experience was not the best because the reimbursement of the cost was very delayed and even not made in full, which is why under phase 3 and phase 2, we mainly ask for community contribution in the form of labor, and secondly for a particular component such as civil works of the pico and micro hydropower projects. Third approach is the sustainability. In order to sustainability of pico and micro hydropower, we also provide technical support to the users committee to mobilize certain fee from the users every month, which they can put aside to pay the operator and also for the repair of equipment as needed. So far, none of the communities that we have supported had to pay for the repair. Lastly, the approach is the focus on women and youth. Under CBREP initiative, we have targeted support to women by supporting improved cooking stoves and by providing rice and flour grinding meal for women empowerment, so that those women not only get access to electricity, but can be empowered by the use of the electricity in their everyday life. At the same time, we also promote youth participation in these projects by encouraging youth to become a local operator or them to engage in assessment and construction of the project. In these initiative and in these experience, we have also faced multiple challenges, which is what I'm going to discuss it now. Firstly, there is a challenge of lack of resources and increasing demands from the communities. We are very grateful for the continuous support of Pawanka Fund for our CBREP initiative. However, we have not been able to raise funds from those other sources. We are exploring various models, but that has not been successful so far. Therefore, there has been a lack of resources in compared to the demands from the communities. The second challenge is the lack of innovations. While we have been asking the communities to become more innovative by the use of electricity for storing of their agricultural produce, etc., the communities has not yet been innovative, and we are still trying to find more ideas of innovations. Lastly, the participation of women and youth has been also challenging. With our best efforts, participation of women and youths have not been yet satisfactory. The lack of participation is mostly due to the patriarchal nature of the society, gendered roles in the communities, and low-level education in the indigenous youth. However, we are trying to address those challenges in making more efforts towards capacity building of youth. And this year, SEMSOS has collaborated with Indigenous Tharu women's organizations, Tharu Women Upliftment Center, TWC, to overcome these challenges. SEMSOS as a technical partner for supporting capacity building of Tharu women and installation of 500 low-carbon cooking stoves and 25 solar irrigation pumps in their homes and communities in southwestern Nepal. Lastly, I would like to conclude by saying that for the energy transition to be truly just, there should be a direct financing from state and donors or investors, and the financing should be adequate, flexible, and sustained, and direct to the indigenous people's own solutions, not through the banks, UN, or NGOs, but via indigenous organizations and institutions. And the states can also encourage such energy-led solutions by providing or offering subsidies or grants to the indigenous-led solutions. And and for the partnership, businesses should also follow the lead of our partner with indigenous peoples and in using their lands and resources, and they should see indigenous peoples as right holders and decision makers, not merely as beneficiaries or stakeholders. And lastly, I would like to say that energy projects should be public, community, private partnership, not only public-public partnership. That means like the community and public-private partnership must be equal. Like they should have like 50% and 50% partnership. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to all our distinguished speakers. I know it's very challenging for us to keep our time, but as time check, we have, it's 11:43. In case you still have some questions, of course, while we have limited time to speak, we have heard our speakers giving us strong messages on how to advance an inclusive and sustainable future for all of us. So if there are any questions from the floor, we still have some time. Just one? Okay, thank you.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you for sharing your experiences and also highlighting that Indigenous people are also contributing to development. From your perspective, I would like to ask, how feasible are partnerships with the private sector? And if it's possible, what are the conditions that are needed for such partnerships to happen? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I think this will also be the time for our speakers to give their concluding remarks as they respond to that question.
Can I start?
Yeah.
Or you want to start from there?
The initiatives that I presented a while ago, a number of them, the one in Malaysia, a number of them were in partnership with the private sector. But it is under the set principles of Indigenous peoples organizations. One, the conduct of free, prior, and informed consent. Two, the respect for Indigenous peoples. Right. Three, the condition that it should not be used by companies as, how they call that, advertisement that they are working with Indigenous peoples and therefore should be also, how they call that, on the violations that they've committed in other areas, no, shouldn't be used as greenwashing. And the third is for Indigenous peoples to be able to lead and govern that initiative. No, the support will be given and let Indigenous peoples identify their needs and priorities and them to implement the full project. Those are the conditions set. But in the right energy partnership with Indigenous peoples, that's a kind of partnership that we're also promoting based on the respect for human rights. And we hope it's not only with UN agencies, but also with the private sector that we can advance more support for Indigenous peoples-led renewable energy solutions that leverages on the leadership of Indigenous peoples.
Just to add also the term of equitable benefit sharing, that it should be underpinned by equitable benefit sharing based on consent, co-ownership of the project, and joint risk. Thank you.
Are there more? Any addition to that?
Just very quickly, I think now, for some time, the climate movement and the human rights, Indigenous peoples' rights movement have not been coming together, and this is a welcome time where you know. No, sorry, I might have misspoke, but yes, I mean now we're seeing more collaborations, and even companies have not been including communities and Indigenous peoples in the conversation. So this is a welcome forum, but we need more of these platforms, and to have more spaces for collaboration. We cannot just be in silos. So I'll end there.
So yeah, I think we are all ending this session now. One that is really stuck me also is that we don't go to the communities and tell them what to do. So I think that's a strong message for all of us to really make this partnership work, especially for Indigenous peoples in the ground. So again, thank you all for coming to this session, and yes, looking forward to more partnerships. Thank you to our speakers.